September 8, 1941, the day the circle closed around Leningrad. The last road out, the Schlisselburg route to the east, was cut off by advancing German and Finnish forces. Nearly 3 million souls were trapped inside the city that had once been the pride of Soviet culture and industry. The radio crackled with Stalin's grim announcement, "Leningrad is besieged." The Germans had not planned to capture the city. Hitler's orders were far darker. Leningrad, he said, was to be erased. Its people would be starved, its name wiped from the map. For the inhabitants, the war that had raged for months suddenly became a personal apocalypse. On that first night, anti-aircraft guns thundered from rooftops as German shells exploded across the Neva River. Families crowded into basements, clutching icons, bread, and photographs of sons at the front. Few could imagine that this siege would last 872 days. A test of endurance so brutal, it would redefine the limits of human survival. Before the war, Leningrad was a jewel of culture, the home of Tchaikovsky's music, Pushkin's poetry, and grand imperial palaces. Now the same hands that once painted, sculpted, and composed were building barricades. Students of the arts carried rifles. Musicians dug trenches. Within weeks, the city transformed itself into a fortress. The famous bridges over the Neva were barricaded with trolleys and sandbags. Statues were wrapped in wood and sand to shield them from shrapnel. Even the Hermitage Museum's priceless paintings were hidden deep underground in vaults. Factories turned to war production overnight. Tank parts were assembled in concert halls. Bullets molded where ballets once danced. Yet even as bombs rained down, the people refused to let Leningrad's spirit die. Pianos were played in basements. Poetry was whispered by candlelight, and every street echoed with a single belief: they would not surrender their city. By October, the city's food supply had nearly collapsed. The last grain shipments were gone, and warehouses lay in ruins after air raids. Bread, once a simple comfort, became the currency of life. The rations were cut to starvation levels, 125 grams a day for workers, barely enough to sustain a child. Sawdust and wallpaper paste were mixed into loaves. Soup was made from boiled leather belts and glue scraped from furniture. Pets disappeared. Pigeons were hunted. Even the seed stalks of the botanical gardens were eaten. The winter came early that year, a brutal cold that froze the Neva solid and killed thousands. Bodies lay frozen in the streets, wrapped in newspaper. People stopped crying because they had no tears left. Hunger stripped away everything, but not their dignity. Many kept diaries, leaving behind haunting words that still echo through history. "We are dying, but we will not surrender." In the darkest winter of 1942, when the city was near death, something remarkable happened. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra announced a concert. Most of its musicians were dead or at the front, but conductor Karl Eliasberg gathered survivors, gaunt, starving men and women who could barely lift their instruments. They rehearsed through frost and fainting spells. Each day, a few more dropped from exhaustion, yet they pressed on. On August 9, 1942, as German artillery thundered from the outskirts, the Symphony No. 7 by Dmitri Shostakovich, written during the siege itself, was performed inside the city. Loudspeakers broadcasted across the front lines. Soviet artillery timed their fire to silence the German guns during the performance. For an hour, music conquered war. Even German officers listening from their trenches later admitted it was one of the most powerful moments they had ever witnessed. In that symphony, starving citizens found something more nourishing than bread: a reason to endure. When the Neva froze solid, the Soviet command saw a faint glimmer of salvation. Across the ice of Lake Ladoga lay the only route out of the city, and the only way supplies could come in. They called it the Road of Life. Convoys of trucks, sleds, and horse carts braved constant air raids to cross the treacherous ice. Many never made it, bombed, shelled, or swallowed by the freezing lake. But every night more came. They brought flour, medicine, and hope. And on their return journeys, they carried out the sick and the young, sometimes in temperatures so low that drivers had to pry their hands off frozen steering wheels. Children were evacuated by the thousands, though many never saw their parents again. For those left behind, every distant rumble from the lake meant one thing: maybe, just maybe, food was coming. The Road of Life became more than a supply line. It was a fragile thread connecting a dying city to the rest of humanity. By the spring of 1942, Leningrad had lost over 500,000 people. Starvation had become the city's shadow. Entire apartment blocks stood silent, every family gone. But the people who remained refused to die quietly. Communal kitchens called victory canteens appeared, where watery soup was shared between neighbors. Children were sent to collect snow to melt for water. Even the dead had to be removed on sleds pulled by the living. Death was everywhere, but so was kindness. Strangers helped bury strangers, and people left scraps of bread for those weaker than themselves. The authorities struggled to maintain order. Posters urged citizens to work and fight for Leningrad. Teachers continued classes in bombed-out schools. Even in starvation, the city's heart kept beating, and that heartbeat, faint, fragile but unbroken, became the soul of the Soviet resistance. In the long months that followed, the siege settled into a terrible rhythm. Days were marked by bombings, nights by the creak of sleds carrying the dead. Yet amidst the horror, life found small ways to persist. Children sketched pictures of the sun they could no longer see. Women planted tiny gardens in shell craters. Soldiers, half-starved themselves, carried old men on their backs to air raid shelters. The people of Leningrad learned to measure time not in hours or days, but in breaths and heartbeats. Diaries from those days speak of a strange transformation, a sense of pride in endurance itself. One young girl wrote, "They can starve us, but they cannot kill our spirit." And she was right. The longer the siege went on, the stronger the people's defiance grew. They had been forgotten by much of the world, but they were not defeated. Outside the city, Soviet armies fought desperately to break the encirclement. The swamps and forests around Leningrad became killing grounds. Soldiers dug trenches in frozen mud, their rifles icing over, their rations as scarce as those inside the city. The Germans called it Operation Northern Light, their plan to crush Leningrad completely. But every attempt failed. Soviet reinforcements coming from as far as Siberia hurled themselves into the fire. Many never reached the front lines, dying in the snow before even seeing the enemy. Inside the city, people could hear the artillery from miles away. The dull thud of shells meant someone was still fighting for them. Hope flickered in the distance like a candle in the wind. For Leningrad, survival was no longer just endurance. It was defiance, pure and unyielding, the refusal of a city to let tyranny erase it from history. The winter of 1942-43 was the coldest in living memory. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, and the city's pipes froze solid. Firewood was as precious as bread, and people tore apart furniture, floorboards, even books to feed their stoves. Those without heat slept beside the ovens of public bakeries, huddling in silence. The smell of smoke and starvation became the city's air. Death was no longer an event, and it was a constant. The dead lay beside the living, wrapped in sheets, waiting for collection. Even the morgues overflowed. The frozen ground was too hard to dig graves, so bodies were stacked in cellars or buried under the snow until spring. There was no energy left for mourning. Families often marked death in a single line in their diaries. "Today, Mother died." And yet, despite this despair, something stubborn persisted, the will to keep living. Each morning, workers reported to their posts in bombed-out factories, faint from hunger but determined to continue production. Children still attended makeshift schools, learning by candlelight with frozen ink. For many, the act of living itself became a silent rebellion against the enemy. Radio Leningrad never stopped broadcasting. It played messages of endurance, poems, and even weather updates, as though pretending life was still ordinary could keep death at bay. The announcers' voices became symbols of hope, telling the starving city, "You are not forgotten. You are not alone." As the siege dragged on, a fragile lifeline kept Leningrad alive. The convoys that crossed Lake Ladoga, the road of life. The ice cracked and groaned beneath their wheels, but the drivers pressed on through darkness, fog, and enemy fire. Many of them were mere teenagers recruited from villages barely old enough to shave. They drove without headlights to avoid detection, guided only by faint lanterns set on sticks across the ice. The road was perilous. German bombers prowled above, and every crossing was a gamble with death. When trucks sank into the freezing lake, other drivers marked the spots with pine branches, silent memorials to their fallen comrades. Still they came, and night after night, trip after trip, hauling flour, grain, and fuel. Every ton delivered meant thousands more could live another day. For the citizens waiting on the shore, the arrival of a single truckload of food felt like a miracle. Children gathered to watch the headlights flicker in the distance, praying each beam would not vanish beneath the ice. Bread rations slowly increased. Not much, but enough to give hope. People began to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, Leningrad might endure until the spring. The road of life became a sacred symbol. Drivers were revered like soldiers. When one convoy commander was asked what drove him to risk his life nightly, he replied quietly, "Because behind me, there is a city of mothers and children who have not yet died." By mid-1943, faint signs of change appeared. The Red Army, after fierce battles on the Volkhov front, managed to open a narrow corridor south of Lake Ladoga, a land route, fragile but real. For the first time in nearly a year and a half, trucks could reach Leningrad without crossing the ice. The news spread like wildfire. The blockade is broken, but the city was far from saved. The passage was narrow, constantly shelled, and the siege continued. Food deliveries improved only slightly, but morale rose dramatically. People began to believe the end might be possible. Children, once skeletal, began to regain strength. Bakeries reopened, though bread was still black and bitter. Workers returned to their machines, producing weapons for the same soldiers fighting to free them. The human toll, however, was immeasurable. Families were shattered. Whole apartment blocks had vanished, their residents erased. Yet the people carried on, repairing tram lines, sweeping rubble, and tending the wounded. One survivor later recalled, "We had forgotten what peace felt like, but we had not forgotten how to hope." Even as shells continued to fall, the citizens of Leningrad began to reclaim life inch by inch. The faint sound of laughter returned to the courtyards. For the first time in 2 years, the city began to breathe again. January 1944. After 2.5 years of siege, the Soviet High Command launched Operation Iskra. Spark. From both sides of the encirclement, Red Army forces surged forward, their artillery shaking the frozen ground. For the soldiers who had waited so long, this was more than a battle. It was vengeance for every starving child, every frozen mother, every silent street. The fighting was savage. The Germans, entrenched and desperate, refused to yield. Soviet tanks crawled through snowdrifts while infantry advanced yard by yard. The city's defenders, weakened but unbroken, watched the horizon for signs of the approaching front. And then on January 27, 1944, it happened. Soviet forces met near the Schlisselburg corridor. The siege was lifted. The announcement came over the radio. Leningrad is free. Air raid sirens blared, but not in warning. This time, as celebration. Artillery roared in a 24-gun salute. People flooded the streets, crying, embracing, collapsing in disbelief. For the first time in nearly 900 days, they could raise their heads without fear of starvation or shells. But victory carried the weight of unimaginable loss. Over 1 million civilians were dead. Yet amidst the ruins, the survivors stood as living proof that even in the face of total annihilation, humanity could not be extinguished. When the siege ended, Leningrad was a ghost city. Streets were lined with the hollow shells of buildings blackened by fire and frost. Snow covered the rubble like a burial shroud. The survivors moved through the silence like phantoms, searching for family, for neighbors, for life itself. The first spring after liberation was bittersweet. Flowers bloomed among the ruins, and the Neva thawed once again. But behind every blooming tree lay memories of those who hadn't survived to see it. Entire generations had been lost. Families that once filled whole apartment blocks were reduced to a single person. The city's victory had come at the cost of its own heart, and yet in that silence the people began to rebuild. Schools reopened. Theaters staged performances again. The Philharmonic played Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony once more, this time not as defiance but as remembrance. The notes echoed through the concert hall like voices of the dead, a requiem for the millions who had fallen but never surrendered. The siege of Leningrad had shown the world the worst humanity could inflict and the greatest resilience it could summon. The city had been starved, bombed, and broken, but it had endured. In the ashes of its suffering, it became immortal, a testament to endurance, faith, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. When the first supply convoys entered the freed city, the soldiers who had fought their way in stopped in stunned silence. What they saw was not a city but a scar, Streets filled with skeletal ruins, the stench of long unburied death still lingering beneath the snow. The soldiers had expected celebration. Instead, they found ghostly figures in tattered coats watching them with hollow eyes. These were not the victors of a great battle. These were the remnants of humanity that had survived hell itself. Doctors who arrived with the liberation forces were overwhelmed. Hospitals were overcrowded with those suffering from starvation, frostbite, and trauma. Many could not be saved. The body, after so long without nourishment, could not accept food anymore. Survivors would later describe how the joy of liberation was mixed with the quiet horror of realizing that they had become strangers to life itself. And yet, slowly, a rhythm of living began to return. The sound of hammers echoed across the city as workers, some barely strong enough to stand, began clearing rubble. Women who had once melted snow for water now organized soup kitchens. Even the smallest acts, lighting a stove, rebuilding a wall, carried immense meaning. They were not just restoring a city, they were reclaiming the right to exist. For the Soviet Union, Leningrad's endurance became a legend, a symbol of defiance and national pride. But for those who lived through it, the siege was not a tale of glory. It was a memory that would never stop aching. They had survived, but survival had a cost they would carry forever. Every survivor of Leningrad carried a story etched into their soul. There was the violinist who buried her instrument in the snow to save it from fire, the mother who traded her wedding ring for a loaf of bread, the little boy who watched his parents die, then kept their ration cards in his pocket for years. The siege had reduced life to its rawest form. Every breath was a battle. In the aftermath, these ordinary citizens became witnesses for history. Writers, teachers, and journalists began recording testimonies, not out of duty, but out of fear that the world might forget. Diaries emerged from drawers and words written in candlelight describing the hunger, the bombings, the frozen silence. They were small, fragile books, but within them lived the heartbeat of an entire city. One such diary belonged to 11-year-old Tanya Savicheva. In her notebook, she wrote the names of her family members as they died one by one. Mama's January 13th, Leica March 17th, all are dead. Only Tanya remains. Her diary would later be displayed at the Nuremberg trials, a simple child's notebook that captured the enormity of human suffering more than any speech could. Through stories like Tanya's, the siege became more than a military event. It became a mirror held up to the human spirit, its fragility, its pain, and its unyielding will to endure. Even in a world where bread was worth more than gold, compassion had somehow survived. When the guns fell silent, another kind of war began, the war to rebuild. The government declared Leningrad a hero city, a title of eternal honor. But titles could not repair shattered walls or feed the hungry. The survivors, thin and exhausted, picked up shovels and hammers. Women filled the ranks of construction crews. Soldiers returned home and built houses where ruins had stood. Slowly, like a scar healing, Leningrad began to take shape again. Factories that once produced shells now made tools and machinery. Schools reopened with teachers who had once taught from bomb shelters. Children who had known only hunger learned again to play in courtyards where snow covered craters. Music returned. The Philharmonic played in a hall that had once echoed with air raid sirens. The notes of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony filled the air once more, this time celebrating not resistance but survival. Yet beneath this revival was a quiet grief. The population had been reduced by nearly half. Every street held memories. The bakery where neighbors starved, the park where bodies were buried under the snow. Many could not speak of those years. The pain was too close. The survivors lived side by side, bound by an unspoken understanding. They had seen the edge of human endurance more and stepped back from it. Even decades later, when new buildings rose and the scars faded, the soul of the city never forgot. The siege of Leningrad was not just a chapter in history. It was part of the city's identity, carried in the eyes of every generation that followed. As the Soviet Union entered the post-war years, Leningrad became a shrine of remembrance. Every January, on the anniversary of the siege's end, the city fell silent. Candles flickered along the Neva River. Veterans in faded uniforms stood beside the young, heads bowed, remembering the hunger, the loss, the courage. The moment was solemn, sacred, not a celebration of victory, but a remembrance of endurance. Memorials rose across the city, stone walls engraved with the words, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." Beneath them rested the remains of hundreds of thousands, many never identified. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery became the heart of this remembrance, a vast field of mass graves blanketed in green grass and eternal flowers. Visitors still speak softly there, as if afraid to disturb the sleep of the dead. But beyond official ceremonies, memory lived in quieter ways. Families told stories at dinner tables, showing faded photographs, sharing the ration cards that had once meant life or death. Some survivors refused to leave the city, saying it was sacred ground. Others left but carried a piece of Leningrad in their hearts, the memory of what it meant to survive when survival seemed impossible. Generations later, that memory continues. Each year, the bells of Leningrad ring not just for those who died, but for those who refused to give up. It is a sound that transcends time, a reminder that even in the darkest winter, the human spirit can burn brighter than any flame. The story of Leningrad is more than a tale of war. It is a warning and a revelation. It shows how fragile civilization can be, how quickly hunger strips away everything but the bare essence of humanity. And yet it also shows how deep human resilience runs, how, even when everything collapses, the will to live, to love, to help one another endures. Historians have long debated the strategic meaning of the siege, whether it changed the course of the war or was merely one tragedy among many. But to those who endured it, such arguments are meaningless. For them, the siege was not about tactics or politics. It was about waking up each morning and deciding to live one more day. In a world that too often glorifies battles, the people of Leningrad remind us that true heroism is quiet. It is the nurse who stays with her patients while bombs fall, the teacher who writes lessons on scraps of paper, the child who shares half a crust of bread with someone hungrier. Their story is a testament that courage is not only found on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender to despair. And as long as the world remembers Leningrad, we remember what it means to be truly human. When the war finally ended in 1945, the guns fell silent across Europe. Cities celebrated liberation, but in Leningrad, celebration was muted. The siege had broken the German army's will, but it had also broken something deep within the people. For nearly 3 years, their world had been hunger and death, and victory felt strangely hollow. They had survived, yes, but at the cost of more than 1 million lives. The official numbers told one story. The faces told another. Families were gone. Whole apartment blocks had no survivors. Cemeteries overflowed, and many who died had never been buried at all, their remains still resting under courtyards and parks. Mothers searched records for the names of lost children. Wives waited for husbands who would never return. The Soviet government hailed the siege as proof of unshakable resolve, but for many survivors, the propaganda felt distant. They had not fought for ideology. They had fought for bread, for warmth, for one more day. And yet, when asked if they regretted staying, most simply said, "It was our city." That single sentence carried the essence of their heroism. Ordinary people who had endured extraordinary suffering, simply because leaving was not an option. History would record Leningrad as unbreakable, but those who lived through it knew the truth. It was not strength that saved them alone, but love. Love for family, for neighbors, for the city itself. In the end, it was love that held back the darkness. After the war, a heavy silence settled over Leningrad. Survivors rarely spoke of what they had endured. The memories were too raw, too painful. Conversations would begin, and then stop mid-sentence as if words themselves were dangerous. Children born after the siege grew up hearing fragments, whispers about the blockade or the winter. The government's focus turned to reconstruction and glory. The trauma of starvation, cannibalism, and death was buried beneath layers of patriotic myth. Officials preferred stories of victory to those of suffering. The diaries that told the truth, like that of Tanya Savicheva, were carefully curated, framed as symbols of heroism rather than cries of despair. In homes, however, the silence carried its own weight. Grandmothers stored bread in secret places, unable to forget the fear of hunger. People hoarded food without knowing why. The city functioned, rebuilt, and smiled for parades. But beneath its surface, grief remained an unhealed wound. It would take decades before survivors began to speak openly. When they did, their voices trembled, not from age but from the memories they had carried in silence for so long. For them, the war had never really ended. It had simply gone quiet. By the 1960s and 70s, a new generation walked the streets of Leningrad. They lived among monuments and memorials, yet often did not fully understand them. To them, the siege was history, something their grandparents spoke of in hushed tones. And yet the city itself remembered. There were invisible reminders everywhere, a building wall still pockmarked with bullets, a faded inscription reading, "Citizens, during shelling this side of the street is more dangerous." The words had never been erased. They stood as silent teachers, reminding the young of what their elders had survived. In schools, children learned about the hero city of Leningrad, about Shostakovich's symphony and the unbreakable Soviet spirit. But in private, they learned something else, that heroism often looked like suffering, and survival was not glorious, but bitter. Many young people grew up haunted by the quiet stoicism of their parents who refused to throw away even crumbs of bread. And yet, this generation carried the memory forward. They built museums, wrote books, and collected stories before time could erase them. They understood that remembrance was not about mourning alone, but about gratitude. Gratitude for those who endured so that life could continue. Outside the Soviet Union, the full horror of the siege of Leningrad was not widely known until decades later. Wartime censorship and Cold War politics had obscured much of the truth. But when survivors' diaries were finally translated and historians gained access to archives, the world was stunned. Photographs surfaced and of frozen corpses in the streets, of children wrapped in rags, of civilians eating wallpaper paste to survive. Yet alongside these images were others, of soldiers carrying bread through snow, of musicians playing in bombed-out theaters, of citizens rebuilding their city brick by brick. Western historians began to call it the deadliest siege in modern history, and with that recognition came respect. The story of Leningrad was not just Soviet history, it was human history. It spoke of the capacity for endurance in the face of unspeakable horror, and of the thin line between civilization and chaos. Documentaries, books, and memorials began to appear around the world. The name Leningrad became a symbol, not of a political system, but of what humanity can endure when everything else is lost. Even in modern-day St. Petersburg, the shadow of the siege lingers. Beneath the vibrant music halls and grand palaces lies the soul of a city that once starved. Each winter, when the cold wind blows off the Neva, older citizens say the same words. This feels like the winter of 41. Survivors still gather each year at the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery. Many are frail, some in wheelchairs wrapped in thick scarves. They lay flowers in the snow, whispering the names of loved ones lost decades ago. The city around them is alive and modern, but in that moment time folds back. The ghosts of the siege stand among them, silent, unseen, but deeply felt. For younger generations, remembering the siege has become a duty. Schools teach it not as propaganda, but as a lesson in resilience. The city that once endured starvation now feeds millions, a quiet act of defiance against history itself. Still, some wounds never heal. The descendants of survivors say their grandparents' trauma echoes in them, in their instinct to store food, in their fear of scarcity, in their reverence for bread. The siege is no longer an event. It is a memory woven into the city's DNA. As the decades pass, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, stands not just as a city of beauty, but as a monument to endurance. Its grand cathedrals, once scarred by bombs, now shine again. Tourists walk the same streets where starving civilians once struggled to stand. Yet if you pause and listen, the echoes are still there. The distant sound of artillery, the whispered prayers of mothers, the rustle of ration cards. The story of the siege is not one of despair, but of defiance. When faced with annihilation, the people of Leningrad did not surrender. They lit candles in the dark. They played music through the bombs. They wrote in diaries knowing they might not live to see their words read. They proved that even when the body breaks, the human spirit can remain unbroken. Every monument, every photograph, every diary entry is a message across time. We lived. Remember us. That plea still speaks to the world today, a reminder of what happens when cruelty meets courage. and when ordinary people refuse to let the light go out. Today, at the heart of St. Petersburg, an eternal flame burns in memory of those who never left the city. It flickers quietly against the cold wind, a symbol of both tragedy and triumph. People pass by it every day, and some pause, some don't. But for those who know, it represents the essence of the human story. The siege of Leningrad was not simply a chapter in World War II. It was the crucible in which the human spirit was tested and proved unbreakable. It showed that courage does not always wear uniforms, and that victory is sometimes measured not in conquest, but in survival. When you stand before that flame, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the city, slow, steady, eternal. It tells us that life can endure even the darkest nights, that compassion can exist amid despair, and that hope once lit never truly dies. The people of Leningrad did not just survive history, they defined it. And as long as the flame burns, so too does the memory of those who refused to surrender to the cold, the hunger, and the silence.